Britain, after the war, desperately needed locomotives, but lacked the copper and funds for American-style diesel electrics. This led to a bold concept: shoehorn 4 screaming V12 engines and 2 superchargers into a single machine, all vying for command over a complex labyrinthine gearbox. Theoretically, it promised to surpass steam engines with sheer mechanical force. In practice, it proved a rolling headache, louder than a squadron of Spitfires, and so delicate that a single loose fastener could dismantle it. 6 engines feeding an unmanageable gearbox amounted to a mechanical nightmare. Why would anyone envision such a machine succeeding? The answer begins with a nation in crisis and a design no one dared to question. In 1947, the Ministry of Supply rationed copper as if it were precious gold. Locomotive factories received barely enough for crucial signaling systems, let alone for the extensive heavy generator windings needed. British Railways, freshly nationalized, faced a financial statement awash in red. Each ton of copper surpassed a fireman's annual earnings. The London Metal Exchange priced copper at £210 per ton, if it could even be acquired. Imports trickled in from Africa and Canada, but half of it was diverted overseas due to Britain's post-war debts. Parliament tightly controlled the remaining supply. Railways were fortunate to receive just 5% of the national quota, only enough to maintain operations, not to build a fleet of American-style diesels. A single diesel-electric locomotive required 20 to 30 tons of copper for its generator and traction motors. Multiplying that by 100 meant consuming a third of the country's yearly copper supply. The Board of Trade crunched the numbers and concluded that each ton added thousands of pounds to a locomotive's cost. Mechanical transmission, in contrast, used very little copper, less than a ton per machine, mostly for control wiring. The rest was made of steel, oil, and human effort. Weight also presented a critical limitation. Many British bridges, some predating the Queen, could not support the axle load of large American diesel locomotives. Civil engineers restricted new locomotives to 21.5 tons per axle. Anything heavier risked the closure of half the rail network, or the expenditure of millions on upgrades no one could afford. Steam engines avoided this issue because their weight was distributed over more wheels. Diesel electrics, with their heavy motors, disproportionately stressed the tracks. The mechanical drive, being inherently lighter, just barely met the weight requirements. On paper, it seemed like a sensible solution. In the workshop, however, it was a different story. Every decision was dictated by what financial controllers and bridge inspectors permitted. Frustration was palpable in the canteen. They expect us to create a miracle, but they won't fund the necessary components. This is how you end up with a locomotive that is all engine and no margin. A machine born of scarcity, constructed within the limitations of what post-war Britain could muster. Mechanical transmission was not merely an ingenious workaround. It became an administrative obsession. The technical committees at British Railways scrutinized axle load calculations with the diligence of priests interpreting omens. The goal for a mainline diesel was a total weight of 116 tons. Exceeding this would cause the bridges to groan, accountants to despair, and the entire modernization effort to falter before it began. Every boardroom memorandum reiterated the same directive: keep it light, keep it simple, keep it cheap. Yet the only way to adhere to those weight limits, given copper rationing and unyielding bridge constraints, was to employ direct wheel drive. No heavy generators, no electric motors, just gears, shafts, and oil. A draft memorandum from March 1949 succinctly stated in dry bureaucratic prose: mechanical transmission is preferred where axle loading and material scarcity introduce operational constraints. This is how the direct drive concept became enshrined in official policy. Civil engineers demanded data, accountants sought savings, and the mechanical engineers promised both, provided someone else handled the intricacies. The technical specifications for the new locomotive required a maximum axle load of 21.5 tons, distributed across enough wheels to ensure bridge integrity. Theoretically, a mechanical system could achieve this, whereas a diesel-electric system would exceed the limit by several tons, primarily due to copper and the bulk of the traction motors. The committees were enamored with the prospect of weight savings, so much so that they were willing to overlook the maintenance challenges it would create. The underlying logic was straightforward. If a sufficiently large, robust, and ingenious gearbox could be built to merge the power of 4 engines into a single drive shaft, both the weight and copper dilemmas would be resolved simultaneously. The gearbox presented a promise. The risk, however, was staking the future of British railways on a machine that had only existed as a design. But when every alternative meant budget overruns or rebuilding half the network, the unconventional path began to appear inevitable. This was the landscape into which Colonel Fell stepped, a world receptive to radical ideas, provided they guaranteed structural stability and appeased the accountants. Leonard Fell did not appear to be a man who would engineer a monstrosity. An RAF colonel, he possessed keen insight and a mind honed by the chaos of airfields and the split-second decisions required for wartime engines. In the realm of trains, he was an outsider, an aerospace engineer who viewed railway problems through the lens of redundancy and risk. If an engine fails at 10,000 feet, you don't await a miracle. You design for potential failure. That's how you ensure survival. So, when railway personnel complained about the lack of a single large diesel, Fell simply shrugged and consulted his notebook. Why not 4 smaller ones? 4 engines, each capable of compensating if another faltered. It was the same principle that kept bombers airborne even when flak damaged a cylinder bank. Yet, this was not a bomber. It was a 50-foot-long metal box on steel wheels, needing to clear British bridges and run on tracks designed for Victorian-era weights. The heart of this Leviathan was the Paxman 512. Each unit was a 500-horsepower block of cast iron and crankshafts, featuring a 7-inch bore and a stroke just under 8 inches. 4 of these were positioned within the frame, 2 at each end, arranged like oarsmen in a racing shell. If they synchronized perfectly, the train surged forward. If one faltered, the entire rhythm threatened to collapse. Fell didn't stop at 4. To extract maximum power from these V12 engines, he incorporated 2 auxiliary AEC diesel engines, each driving a roots blower to force air into the main engines. 6 engines in total, each with its designated task, each with its own oil leaks and peculiarities. The auxiliaries started first, hissing and whirring as they built pressure for the main event. The main engines followed, each a symphony of pistons and valves awaiting activation by the throttle operator. This was no ordinary locomotive. It was a mobile experiment in regulated chaos, conceived by a man who believed complexity could be mastered through adherence to its inherent rules. The challenge extended beyond mere horsepower. It involved synchronizing all those moving parts and hoping none of them impeded the others. Fluid couplings provided a delicate handshake between the engines and the gearbox, a mechanism to prevent all that power from self-destruction. Imagine 2 fans facing each other within a sealed drum. One is connected to the engine, spinning with increasing speed. The other is linked to the wheels, anticipating the surge. There is no direct physical connection, only a bath of viscous oil. As the first fan churns the oil, the second begins to rotate, propelled by the swirling fluid. This is how torque is transmitted from the engine to the wheels without the metal-on-metal impact that would instantly destroy a clutch. But the real ingenuity lay in the scoop tube. This was not a fixed reservoir of oil. It was adjustable on the fly. At lower speeds, the scoop withdrew most of the oil from the working chamber, allowing the engine to accelerate gently while the wheels lagged. The slip between the two fans was substantial, sometimes reaching 20%. One would hear a rising howl as the fluid agitated, cushioning the jolt that would otherwise fracture a shaft or strip a gear. As the train gained momentum, the scoop tube retracted, allowing more oil to flood in. With the chamber nearly full, the two fans engaged almost completely, and the slip reduced to a mere 1 or 2%. This meant nearly all the engine's power reached the rails with minimal loss to heat or noise, at least in theory. This controlled slip was the crucial difference between a smooth start and a pile of shattered components. Insufficient oil would prevent movement. Too much, too soon, would cause the entire machine to lurch and groan. Engineers calibrated the oil level so that at speed, only a minimal amount of slip, just enough for safety, remained. Most days, this entailed a loss of about 1 to 4% of the engine's output, a trade-off for not having to rebuild the gearbox weekly. With 4 engines, each having its own fluid coupling, the system could blend power like a bartender mixing drinks. One engine could be engaged gently, then another, each seamlessly entering the flow without sending shock waves down the drive shaft. The scoop tubes allowed the driver to feather the engagement, preventing the entire assembly from self-destructing. It was a subtle, almost elegant solution, until the gears had to take over. That's when the real problems surfaced. The Fels gearbox was a testament to persistent engineering. 3 differentials were stacked and sequentially locked, all striving to manage the uncontrolled force of 4 main engines. Each engine delivered its power through a fluid coupling, then into a set of gears that not only merged torque, but also regulated it. 2 engines at the front, 2 at the rear, all converging in a dense central housing that resembled a strong box more than a transmission. The initial differential linked the engines at each end. Subsequently, a secondary differential combined these 2 power streams. If all engines synchronized perfectly, the outcome was a smooth, powerful acceleration. However, if one faltered, the gears would clash, causing the entire assembly to violently shake as if in a mechanical dispute. Yet, the gearbox was only one aspect of the system. Powering the main V12 engines required more than just fuel. It demanded a vast supply of air. This is where the 2 auxiliary AEC diesels, each generating 150 horsepower, became crucial. Their sole purpose was to drive the massive roots blowers, which force-fed air into the main engines. Without these blowers, the V12 engines would struggle at low speeds, lacking the oxygen and torque necessary to propel the train. The count thus rose to 4 large engines for propulsion and 2 smaller ones to support them. 6 engines, a single gearbox, and a network of shafts and belts extended along the frame. The auxiliary engines always started first, their high-pitched whine reverberating through the steel before the main engines even showed signs of life. The power transmission followed a sequential path. Auxiliary engines powered the blowers supplied the main engines drove the fluid couplings, the couplings fed the differentials, and the differentials strove to maintain balance. Everything ultimately converged to a single output shaft, channeling all this effort to the wheels. The torque demands were immense. Every shaft, bearing, and bolt had to withstand the combined intensity of 6 engines. Paxman gear designers reportedly called it a nightmare. Mechanics jokingly claimed one needed a physics degree simply to perform an oil change. Each time the gearbox was opened, a sense of apprehension arose. Would this be the day a gear tooth was missing or a bearing ran dry? The constant threat was that a single improper shift could tear the entire mechanism apart. The morning ritual commenced with a sound unique to this locomotive, a high-pitched whine emanating from deep within the frame. These were the auxiliaries, 2 AEC diesels, each scarcely the size of a car engine, but revving as if their very existence depended on it. Their entire task was to operate the roots blowers, forcing air into the four main Paxman 512 engines. Without this boost, there was no power. One would wait for the green light on the manifold gauge before even attempting to start engine 1, which always initiated the sequence. Turning the key, the V12 roared to life. 12 pistons rhythmically pounding in their cylinders. The cab vibrated. A quick check of the gauges, oil pressure, manifold air, coolant temperature. Everything needed to be optimal. If the auxiliary engines failed to provide sufficient air, the main engine wouldn't even ignite. If oil pressure dropped, immediate shutdown was necessary, followed by reaching for the toolbox. No one wanted to be responsible for stripping a bearing before the train had even begun its journey. With engine 1 running at idle, the next phase was a carefully orchestrated maneuver. The scoop lever, a simple rod on the control panel, was the sole barrier between a smooth engagement and a gearbox filled with debris. Gently pulling it back caused the scoop tube inside the fluid coupling to begin filling the chamber with oil. Initially, it was just a trickle. The impeller spun, slinging oil at the turbine, but the slip was substantial, perhaps 20%. The wheels gradually advanced, almost gliding. Too much oil, too quickly, and the entire drivetrain would lurch, sending tremors through every bearing and bolt. Too little, and the engine would roar while the train remained stationary. Once the train reached a walking pace, roughly 6 miles per hour, the moment when the slip significantly decreased was perceptible. The scoop tube extended further, allowing more oil in, and the torque connected with the rails. That signaled the moment for engine 2. Another V12, another set of gauges, another silent plea. Engaging it too soon would cause the engines to fight each other, transmitting pulses down the shaft that could fracture a differential gear. Waiting too long would result in a loss of momentum, with the entire mass of the train threatening to stall. The two engines had to synchronize their revolutions almost perfectly, or the gearbox would retaliate with a shriek that resonated through one's teeth. Every stage demanded precision. The driver's hands danced between the throttle and scoop, eyes darting from tachometer to oil pressure to the vibration in the floorboards. Missing a cue meant feeling the machine's displeasure, a tremor, a groan, perhaps a spike on the oil temperature gauge. The auxiliaries continued their hum, their task far from complete. As long as the main engines required air, those small diesels spun at full capacity, feeding the Leviathan. The entire process was a delicate balance. Every lever and dial served as a reminder that this was no ordinary train. It was a mobile experiment, and the crew were part of the controlled observation. By the time both engines were engaged, and the train was steadily moving at 6 miles per hour, a brief sense of relief was earned. However, the true challenge was just unfolding. 2 more engines awaited their turn, and the gearbox had yet to reveal its full capabilities. For now, every bearing held, every gauge remained in the green, and the monster, barely subdued, never truly under control, moved forward. At 17 miles per hour, the third V12 entered the fray. The driver delicately adjusted the scoop lever, observing the tachometers fluctuate as engine 3 spooled up. The cab's floorboards began a low-frequency hum, a tremor that ascended one's legs and settled into the bones. Each additional engine didn't merely increase power, it amplified the noise and tripled the risk. 4 rowers in a boat, the seasoned operators would recount. If they pulled in unison, you flew. If one caught a crab, the oars would tangle, and the entire crew would end up in the water. Within the gearbox, the differentials strained to maintain order. 3 engines now, each with its distinct rhythm, each feeding torque through a labyrinth of gears. The vibration monitor, a simple dial affixed to the bulkhead, commenced its erratic movements. At this velocity, the slip in the fluid couplings neared its minimum. the whirring of oil churning between the impeller and turbine, seeded to a harsher, more metallic resonance. The cab heated up, the air heavy with the scent of diesel and scorched lubricant. The driver wiped perspiration from his brow, his gaze alternating between the rev counters and the oil pressure gauge. Missing a rev match by more than a few revolutions per minute would cause the entire gearbox to lurch. The crew braced themselves, feet firmly planted, hands grasping anything within reach. The auxiliary engines shrieked in the background, feeding the blowers that prevented the main V12 engines from suffocating. 6 engines, each howling in its own register. The sound was less like a train and more akin to an air raid. Layer upon layer of mechanical fury, each threatening to break free. At 24 miles per hour, the fourth and final engine engaged. The tachometer needles aligned, 4 red markers quivering just below the danger zone. The gearbox, now compelled to channel the full 2,000 horsepower, vibrated under the immense strain. The vibration peaked. Paxman's own test logs documented oscillations forceful enough to loosen bolts on the cab panels. The floor vibrated so violently that remaining stationary became an act of sheer will. Crewmen sometimes tucked rags beneath their boots to prevent their feet from going numb. The noise reached an indescribable level. Even with hearing protection, conversation was impossible. Every surface in the cab became a sounding board, amplifying the clatter of pistons, the whine of gears, the shriek of the blowers. The air shimmered with heat. The odor of hot oil intermingled with a metallic tang of ozone from sparking relay contacts. Every sense was under siege. Yet, for a brief interval, with all 4 engines pulling in perfect synchronicity, the train surged forward, unlike anything else on rails. The tractive effort at 12 miles per hour reached 25,000 pounds, the kind of force capable of hauling a coal train from a flooded mine. The entire machine felt alive, straining at its limits, defying anyone aboard to trust it for merely 1 more mile. Nevertheless, everyone in the cab understood the truth. The gearbox was the weak point, the antagonist in this narrative. With every surge, every vibration, every spike on the dial, one could feel the monster testing its own restraints. It was a symphony of noise and power, beautiful, terrifying, and perpetually on the precipice of disintegration. The cab was already vibrating like a jackhammer when the incident occurred. 4 engines at full throttle, the gearbox screaming under 2,000 horsepower, and every bolt in the transmission striving to keep the behemoth intact. Then, without warning, a bolt deep within the gearbox gave way. Perhaps it was a hairline fracture. Perhaps metal fatigue from thousands of hours of vibration. Whatever the cause, the outcome was instantaneous. One moment, the gears were meshing at hundreds of revolutions per minute. The next, a piece of steel sheared cleanly off and shot directly into the teeth of the main cog. The sound was like ordnance, metal striking metal, a deafening crunch that overpowered even the engines. In the blink of an eye, the perfectly synchronized dance of pistons and gears devolved into pandemonium. The main differential seized completely. The shockwave ripped through the gearbox, and the casing shattered as if made of glass. Oil erupted from the breach, splattering across the cab and coating everything in a slick black film. The floor lurched, flinging tools and lunchboxes against the bulkheads. For a moment, no one could ascertain if the machine was still moving or if the entire train had derailed. Inside the gearbox, the gears did not simply stop. They attempted to continue rotating, grinding themselves into fragments. The failed bolt, now wedged between 2 spinning gears, acted like a wedge in a log splitter. Teeth broke off, bearings collapsed, and the entire assembly seized within seconds. The vibration, which had commenced as a cautionary hum, now rattled every bone in the crew's bodies. The engineers' hands became stiff on the throttle. A shout went unheard amidst the din and the spattering of oil on hot metal. Silence eventually returned, broken only by the sound of oil dripping onto the ground and the hushed sizzle of cooling metal. The mechanical behemoth lay inert. A mere bolt, just scant inches of steel, had felled 4 engines, a multitude of moving components, and the aspirations of engineers who believed they could conquer physics with gears and lubrication. Retrieving the failed machine to Derby Works was no minor feat, not merely attaching another locomotive and towing it back. Clearing the railway lines was the first hurdle. Oil coated the track ballast, and the rails themselves glistened from the spray. A repair crew arrived, equipped with sand, shovels, and a vocabulary of expletives. They labored for hours to clean the extensive mess, just to allow a rescue engine close enough to connect. The crippled machine, a dead weight of 116 tons, had to be hauled at a painstakingly slow pace. Lacking brakes or power, it was a colossal, quiet hulk traversing the Peak District. Each mile presented fresh hazards. The jammed gearbox threatened to seize the wheels, and any sudden jolt risked further damage to the already compromised frame. The tow journey consumed the better part of a day, inching from the hills near Manchester back towards Derby. Traffic accumulated behind it, and schedules unraveled. Crews along the route shook their heads as the oil-streaked and disgraced black box limped past. At Derby Works, the true endeavor commenced. The locomotive was shunted into a siding, and disassembly began. Mechanics faced a gearbox that had ruptured. Oil had permeated every crevice, mingling with metallic fragments and shattered bearings. The primary casing, once a steel bastion, was now fractured and distorted. Gears designed for a decade's service were ground down to nubs. The faulty bolt, or what remained of it, was retrieved from between 2 broken teeth, charred and twisted. Repair invoices began to accumulate. The initial estimate for the gearbox overhaul amounted to £1,200, exceeding the annual salary of a skilled fitter. Parts required bespoke fabrication, as nothing suitable was commercially available. The locomotive stood idle for weeks, then months, as Derby's finest attempted to reassemble the monstrous machine. Each day it languished in the yard served as a stark reminder of the cost of overcomplication. The maintenance crew's morale suffered a lasting blow. A common saying emerged in the workshops: if the infernal machine arrived, you'd better hope your name wasn't on the roster. The task was thankless, grimy, and seemed interminable, and everyone harbored the deep-seated fear that the next bolt failure could trigger the same disaster. September 1958. The locomotive lay dormant in a siding at Derby Works, its paint streaked and its designation already fading from the records. The ultimate demise stemmed not from the gearbox or the engines, but from the steam heating boiler situated behind the cab, a stout metal drum intended to warm passengers on winter journeys. That morning, something went awry. Perhaps a pressure valve malfunctioned. Perhaps a fuel line leaked. Or perhaps it was simply the persistent misfortune that plagued this machine from its inception. The boiler ignited. Flames consumed the wooden paneling, fueled by decades of accumulated varnish and grease. Within scant minutes, the rear of the locomotive became an inferno. The fire brigade responded swiftly, yet not swiftly enough. By the time their hoses extinguished the last embers, the superstructure was gutted. The cab roof sagged, glass had melted into puddles on the floor, and paint blistered off in sheets. Charred wiring dangled from the ceiling like dark spaghetti. The gearbox, despite its inherent resilience, was entombed beneath a layer of soot and ash. Post-fire photographs depicted a skeletal remains. Shattered windows, warped steel, the entire rear section distorted by the intense heat. The outlines of the engines were still discernible, but the machine's vital core was obliterated. The fire did not merely end its operational life, it extinguished any prospect of restoration. No one at Derby Works even contemplated a rebuild. The directive arrived within days. Dismantle it, sell the scrap, and move forward. The loudest mechanical nightmare on British rails concluded not with a thunderous roar, but with a whisper and a cloud of greasy smoke. The fire had barely ceased smoldering when the administrative procedures began. British rail management wasted no time on sentimentality. Within a week, a memorandum from Derby Works reached the chief mechanical engineer's desk, detailing the costs in stark terms. Reconstructing the failed machine entailed more than just mending charred paint and melted wires. The gearbox alone would necessitate another complete overhaul. New gears, fresh bearings, and a custom-made set of bolts at exorbitant prices. The engines, already past their prime, required a thorough disassembly to check for heat damage. Even the auxiliary blowers and control wiring would need replacement. The preliminary estimate exceeded £3,000, and that figure did not account for the weeks lost in the workshop or the labor hours Derby could not bill to a paying client. Across the corridor, the finance department conducted their own calculations. By September 1958, a brand new diesel-electric locomotive could be acquired for less than £30,000, delivered with a warranty and a service agreement. The copper shortage was easing, and the latest traction motors weighed half as much as those from a decade prior. Every pound expended on the defunct machine was a pound not invested in modernizing the fleet. The budget memoranda unequivocally stated that the experiment had run its course. The Class 1010 was unique. It had no spare parts, no production line, and no prospect of economies of scale. Even if the fire had not occurred, another breakdown was perpetually imminent. The official authorization to scrap was issued on September 22, 1958. A single entry in the asset register read, "Withdrawn to be dismantled." No ceremony, no second chances. For the personnel in the depot, it was a welcome reprieve. The mechanical monster that had tormented the workshops was finally destined for the cutting torch. The lesson was as unmistakable as the balance sheet. Sometimes, the only viable path forward is to accept losses and move on. Today, railway systems prioritize quiet operation and dependability. Complexity is seen as an adversary, not an aspiration. The legacy of the failed machine endures as a cautionary tale. Elegant engineering often implies fewer moving parts, not more. As artificial intelligence and automation propel us toward increasingly intricate networks of code and machinery, the genuine peril is not failure. It is overlooking that simplicity is essential for survival. Every innovation carries its own intrinsic warning. Thank you for journeying through this account of mechanical folly. Let me know what you would trust on your next voyage.